transmission.
Yeah, that transmission he said was unreasonable. It sounded like someone said they have a bomb on board.
Affirmative, he said there was a bomb on board. That's what we thought. We just we didn't get it clear.
That aircraft you can't get a hold of. Is he turned to the east now?
Do you have a visual on him now?
We did, but we lost him in the turn.
If you can make a turn back to a 220 heading, let me know if you can see him.
They were making a turn at 956.
Anybody northwest of you?
We're looking now, sir.
Okay, American 1060 and Executive 956, we just lost the target on that aircraft.
Something weird is going on.
Yeah.
The World Trade Center is on fire.
Oh my Seriously.
Goodness. Top level of one of the...
A plane crashed. Just...
My sister's in that building.
Okay.
And I hope she's okay, and I gotta run to New York. Oh my God, it's complete pandemonium.
All right, first of all, calm down.
There's raining papers and ashes. And
105 wants to 1025.
Second airplane, a 727 just rammed into the building.
Oh my God, it was a huge explosion.
Forget about the damn car.
People are jumping out the windows. Over there, they're jumping out the windows.
A second plane is now flown in.
Wait, explosion at the Pentagon?
A third location is on alert and outside of
I
Washington.
don't have words to describe what I'm witnessing right now.
Effective immediately until further notice. Flight operations in the national airspace system are prohibited.
freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward, and freedom will be defended.
Oh, God.
Oh, my God.
On itself, and it is
just landed on Manhattan.
All right, so now we look back up to the TV. One of the World Trade Towers has collapsed and fallen.
I've never seen anything like this.
I've got 5 patients. They need to be... An ambulance full of cops and pedestrians. Building just collapsed. Don't have much more. Another tower that just came down 1013. All the cops away from the building. You got a female officer down. Female officer, where are you now, King? Where are you, King?
My God, look at the skyline without the towers.
Honestly, I just wanted to let you know I love you, and I'm stuck in this building. I'm waiting at the building where Mom went off. We don't know, but there's lots of smoke, and we just wanted you to know that I love you always.
Just know it will prevail.
We will not turn.
It is as old as the scriptures.
We will not falter.
And is as clear
And we will not fail.
as the American Constitution.
Let's roll, let's roll, let's roll.
Quebec United 93. Quebec United 93.
I welcome this kind of examination.
We came,
and for the international order that we have worked for generations to build.
A new world order. New world order.
we saw.
If suddenly there was a threat to this world from some other species, from another planet, outside in the universe.
Always talk to you like they're the law.
And then we're going to Washington, D.C. to take back the White House!
He died. He died.
But that's a wicked woman.
Because people have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
You can keep it. Period. 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 They are the focus of evil in the modern world. It's a catastrophe.
Deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome.
This is the Midnight Rider News Podcast. Hello, America and the world. Welcome to the Midnight Rider News Show. I'm S.T. Patrick, your friendly neighborhood host, traipsing through the trials and travails that have so tempestuously and untruthfully been blasted into your eyes, ears, and minds by the state-sponsored talking heads, court historians, and textbook conglomerates that control information today. Tonight, we have episode 019, the Corbett Report on 9/11. Our featured guest tonight is researcher James Corbett, who owns and operates the Corbett Report. He'll join us from Japan in the midnight hour. But before he does, however, we'll talk to Richard Otto about how 9/11 affected national security. Then we'll talk to Midnight Rider News' own Brian Lloyd about what it was like to be in Washington, D.C. on 9/11. Now, Brian has some interesting experiences to tell you about, so I'm sure you'll want to stay tuned for that. First, a little, or a lot, of cleaning of the castle. Our Facebook page is at Midnight Rider News Show. Please like us there. That's Midnight Rider News Show. And hey, guess what? It's now vital to like us there, as I again have no Facebook account. Now, by that I mean I have no personal Facebook account. I was informed this week that it has again been disabled, and again without explanation. Now, they've asked me to jump through hoops like I'm a gymnast just to grace their kingdom once again. But frankly, I think we're just going to explore other options first. So, we're at a point of feeling harassed by Facebook, no surprise, and to be honest, I just don't beg very well. So if you're wondering if I've unfriended you, rest assured I have not. It is once again a Facebook thing, with Facebook being, well, Facebook. They've always treated us poorly, and I guess we shouldn't expect it to be any other way. But let me say that I know now, and I know and understand, and I empathize with what Brent Holland and his show have gone through with YouTube. It's constant and continual problems, simply trying to disseminate the truth. So I understand. So please support Brent Holland and his show, and please support us. So until further notice, the Midnight Rider News Show page on Facebook is still being capably administered by 3 other people. All information on new episodes and new information about MidnightRiderNews.com will come from them and through the Midnight Rider News Show page on Facebook. If you haven't liked the page, please do so. If you aren't sure if you've liked the newest incarnation of the page, you can use the Facebook link on the website to get to the specific page itself. Our Twitter is and remains MWN_ST Patrick. I will be even more active on Twitter now, so please follow us there. Our email is midnightridernews@gmail.com, midnightridernews@gmail.com. So we'll be right back with Richard Otto, Brian Lloyd, and James Corbett. He's the godfather of reality television, and now he has taken the reality of the JFK assassination straight to the establishment media in part 2 of the Jim Garrison tapes. John Barber is a pioneer, a conversationalist, a storyteller, and a friend of truth seekers worldwide.
Hi, this is John Barber, writer-director of the American Media and the second assassination of President John F. Kennedy. If you want to know how I continue to challenge the media elites in the name of Jim Garrison's legacy, listen to episode 10 of the Midnight Rider News Show.
Our first guest, Richard Otto, has joined us before. He's the author of The Paradox of Our National Security Complex, How Secrecy and Security Diminish Our Liberty and Threaten Our Democratic Republic. It can be purchased on Amazon.com, and we're glad he made a few minutes for us again tonight. So, Richard, welcome back to the show. Now, September 11th certainly impacted America's national security, no matter what you believe really happened that day. So what we'd like to ask you is how 9/11 affected America's national security and how the country has changed in its wake.
Well, first of all, the 9/11 event did significantly change who we are and the national security complex. However, what it didn't change us in the sense that there was completely new types of philosophies towards national security that were being developed because of that event. We, in many ways, developed the same type of security, national security complex, with the same types of fears and anxieties that were implanted in the people's minds, that were promoted by the media after World War II, when we had the communist scare and the passage of the National Security Act of 1947. And then, of course, when the NSA and the CIA sort of went rampant, unsupervised during the 1950s and developed into these very powerful entities in our national security complex, such that they were influencing our foreign policy and our domestic policy, and were intimidating a lot of our leaders. In terms of 9/11, however, we essentially, Iraq was the main thrust of our policy that caused us to go down a very dark path. And in fact, in 2001, Bush passed the National Energy Policy Development Group, and assigned his vice president, Dick Cheney, the head of an energy task force whose objective was to create a national energy policy that was environmentally sound and affordable, which sounds like a very benign, good program. Unfortunately, most of it was classified, so the media and the public were unaware of what they were doing until there was a lawsuit filed in 2003 under the Freedom of Information Act. That lawsuit was successful in getting a lot of the documents that this task force was involved in released. And Michael Clare wrote a very fine article, which I cited in my book, The Paradox of Our National Security Complex, in January of 2004, describing what these documents had contained. What was in them were maps of Iraqi oil fields, pipelines, refineries, terminals. They also had charts describing Iraqi oil fields and gas projects, and they seemed to be searching for foreign suitors for Iraqi oil field contracts. And so Dick Cheney, with his energy cabal, who were made up of people from the energy industry, were basically carving up Iraq in March of 2001, 6 months before 9/11 even occurred. Okay, so now you have 9/11. You have the terrible tragedy, the towers collapse, and one of the planes hits the Pentagon. Another plane allegedly crashes in a Pennsylvania field due to heroics by the passengers who realized what was going on and sacrificed their lives to prevent the plane from hitting the Capitol or the White House, wherever the target was. And it basically put on a silver platter a justification for these people within the Bush administration to come up with a plan to justify overthrowing Saddam Hussein's government in Iraq. And essentially, Bush assigned Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, and George Tenet, who was the head of the CIA, to put together a package of intelligence that they could use to try to justify an action as drastic as potentially sending the military in and physically overthrowing Saddam Hussein's government. What they did was they collected a bunch of spacious intelligence that I believe that they knew was crap, but they had to get a messenger that was impeccable and honorable and that people respected. And they got Colin Powell to be their front man. He unwittingly engaged in this. I don't think that he thought the intelligence was false or faulty or not trustworthy. I think he believed that they had made a compelling case, which he presented to the United Nations. He had an impeccable history in the military. He had been a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And in the Bush administration, he was the Secretary of State. He made his case to the United Nations, and the Bush administration began to push for the ability to deal with Saddam Hussein and the threat that he posed to the region because of the claims that he had weapons of mass destruction and that he was a haven for terrorist organizations such as Al-Qaeda and may have even assisted them in 9/11. Of course, we now know that that was all false. In any event, the Bush administration then filed the Iraq resolution in Congress to get congressional support to move forward with their plans. And the Iraq resolution basically was set up and modeled after the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. It was trying to circumvent the Constitution in the sense that they wanted to use military power without Congress exercising their constitutional obligation to declare war. They wanted to be able to use military power without going through that constitutional process. And so they were asking Congress to pass a resolution that gave President Bush, the ability to use any means necessary to deal with the threat that Saddam Hussein posed to our allies and our own national security interests, even if it meant military intervention. Congress overwhelmingly supported that resolution. Now, there were a few in the Senate that objected to it, that actually had learned from history. Senator Edward Kennedy had voted for the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. He'd already been burned once by President Johnson, and he voted against it. And, of course, Bernie Sanders, the independent senator from Vermont, voted against it, among others. Hillary Clinton, as we know, voted for that resolution. She didn't learn anything from history. And once Bush had that resolution, much like Johnson, he began to prepare for invading Iraq under what was called Operation Iraqi Freedom, another Orwellian phrase. They were engaging in nothing to do with Iraqi freedom. It most likely had to do with the fact that, well, Bush had some personal things he wanted to resolve with Saddam Hussein, and it had a lot to do with about his oil reserves and the fact that he wasn't cooperating the way they wanted him to. And so they went in there with this shock and awe campaign, and they basically not only destroyed his military, they did overthrow his regime. They ended up capturing him. He was tried, and he was executed. In addition to that, we were in as well, we went into Afghanistan, which is the longest American war, and we're still in there, and the soldiers are still dying. That is as well a failed state. The government is completely corrupt. And the Taliban, since the troop surge under the Obama administration was reduced back to the levels that they are now, the Taliban has reclaimed whole sections of that country. It's a lost cause, and the only reason I think we're in there is because, well, they found $1 trillion worth of minerals that they might want to exploit. And I hate to say this, but it seems to me wherever we are and the CIA exists, the drug trade goes up substantially, and the opium market has grown significantly since we've been involved in Afghanistan. And we also created the Department of Homeland Security under the Homeland Security Act of 2002. That department was involved in border security, counterterrorism, cybersecurity, immigration, response, recovery, strategic planning, and this was the largest department created since the National Security Act of 1947 created the Department of Defense. This is a huge bureaucracy that has had a great deal of consequences for Americans. Some of it you can make an argument is reasonable. Other parts of it, I think it's encouraged profiling. It's encouraged the militarization of our local and municipal police forces. It's encouraged these stop and frisk type of policies as people are searching for terrorists or terrorist activities within the country, undermining our Constitution and undermining our liberties, and engaged in forms of racial and religious profiling, which I think is a very slippery slope to be engaged in. In addition, the National Security Agency, because of 9/11, they have created these gigantic surveillance collection programs with their supercomputers that are collecting information not just on foreign governments or people suspected of being part of terrorist cells or organizations, but they're also collecting all kinds of information on American citizens and our allies. One of the more famous cases, of course, was German Chancellor Merkel's cell phone was tapped into, in which she demanded an apology from President Obama. Now, one of the big operations that the NSA was engaged in was Operation PRISM, and this particular operation collected Internet communications from at least 9 major U.S. Internet companies. And I mean, as I talked in the last time on one of your shows that I had the fortune to be a part of, these programs are violating the Fourth Amendment. They're violating, all kinds of constitutional protections for individual citizens of the United States. They're doing all of this without any probable cause to believe that anyone is involved in any criminal activities or associations with terrorist organizations. They're just collecting this information, and they are telling us not to be worried that they're only using it for the interest of the public. And of course, if you know the history of intelligence, in many cases that's not what is done. And you're giving knowledge is power, and when people are operating in the dark and no one's really supervising them and there's no accountability, a lot of times this knowledge is used in inappropriate ways that undermine our democratic republic and violate our Constitution. And so these are the major things that have occurred since 9/11.
Yes, there definitely have been changes that have altered who we are, what we can do independently of a grossly watchful eye, and 9/11 has also really changed our relationship with both our government and with one another. Now, we've absolutely traded liberty for security, and I'm not sure that we have either at this point. So thank you, Richard. We look forward to hearing from you again. Now we turn to our favorite trial attorney, compadre, and man about the Capitol. the chief Washington, D.C. correspondent for Midnight Rider News, Brian Lloyd. Now, Brian, you were in Washington, D.C. on September 11, 2001, and you, in fact, live very close to the Pentagon. What did you see and what did you hear that morning?
Yes, ST, first of all, it's good to be with you again. On 9/11, the morning of 9/11, I was in my third-floor apartment in Washington, D.C., and I lived on 5th Street. And for those who don't know, Washington, D.C., the numbered streets run north and south. And so I'm on 5th Street, a few blocks from the National Mall. Now, the National Mall, for those that don't know, is not a shopping mall. The National Mall is the grassy area with pools in between the National Capitol and the Lincoln Memorial, with the National Monument in the middle. Of course, many will recall that Martin Luther King Jr. gave his I Have a Dream speech there from the Lincoln Memorial. So when we say National Mall, we're talking about the several-mile grass strip, which is lined with all the Smithsonian museums, and that's where people go jogging, and it's a beautiful thing because you look left and you can see the Capitol. You look right, there's the Lincoln Memorial. You can go up in the National Monument. You can go to all the museums. That's what the National Mall is. And so my apartment on 5th Street was only a few blocks north of the National Mall. A few blocks south of the National Mall, D.C. ends, and you're traveling into Virginia. Just over the border from Washington, D.C., is Arlington, Virginia, and the Pentagon. So it's very, very close to D.C., all right? Now, the official story we're told is that Hani Hanjour, who was flying the plane that allegedly hit the Pentagon, flew over the National Mall, which I just described, did a 180, went back south into Virginia, somehow, did another 180, because he then hit the south side of the Pentagon, which is facing away from D.C. So really you're talking about quite an acrobatic feat here, which many pilots have said, I couldn't have done it. Very experienced pilots have said, I couldn't do that. In fact, Hani Hanjour, the alleged perpetrator of the Pentagon attack, his flight school instructor has been interviewed, and anyone can, view that on YouTube. And he said that guy couldn't fly a Cessna. In fact, I had the feeling that he was only in this course to really go through the motions. It didn't appear that he was really even serious about getting a pilot's license. But nonetheless, this is the testimony of the man who was training him to fly. And he said that guy couldn't fly a Cessna. So again, fast forward to 9/11, and you've got a guy doing acrobatics over the mall, then going south into Virginia, turning around again, and hitting the Pentagon on the south side. And as many of us already know, it was the only face of the Pentagon that had been recently reinforced. So the only part of the Pentagon that had been reinforced, one may say, for what? Why did they spend all that money reinforcing one wall of the Pentagon? Were they expecting something? I mean, generally, we have Air Force bases around here because we have two airports, Dulles International and Reagan National, which is really close, actually, to the Pentagon. So we have to believe, and I think it's been disclosed already, that there were defensive measures in place to deal with somebody invading airspace. I mean, D.C. is a no-fly zone. You can't just fly your plane over the mall. That doesn't happen. It is controlled heavily with the air traffic controllers and the military. Otherwise, you would get what we saw, which is anyone could just dive bomb into the White House, the Capitol, the Pentagon. So the whole side question is, where were the missile defenses? Well, that leads me to another point, which is, so I told you I was on 5th Street, standing on my balcony, which is the top floor, looking down 5th Street south, and I couldn't see the Pentagon itself because of buildings in the way, but I could see the smoke pouring up from the Pentagon. I didn't hear a big collision, but I did see the smoke. Now, we mentioned, there should be a missile defense, there should be some protection of the D.C. protected airspace. Well, I have a friend who lives about 2 miles south of the Pentagon on a road in Arlington called Columbia Pike. Now, Columbia Pike ran, I don't know if it's exact north-south, I think it might be at an angle, but nonetheless, it was known, like you could, if you worked at the Pentagon, for example, you could take a bus to get to work. So that was a known way to get to the Pentagon. Well, what else was along Columbia Pike? Well, there was something called the Navy Annex Building. And the Navy Annex Building is very interesting for a number of reasons. The Navy Annex Building was built in 1941, was used by different government agencies over the years, chiefly the military, and chiefly the Navy. But Marines were there at times. And very interestingly, at the time of 9/11, what else was there? The Missile Defense Agency was there. Now, I looked up a Washington Post article from 2012, which anyone else can do too, just do history of the Navy Annex Building. And you'll see a picture. But in that very article from the Washington Post, which had nothing to do with conspiracy, of course, or anything to do with 9/11 even, but it says the Navy Annex Building was on a hill overlooking the Pentagon. Now, this building was built in 1941 as a supposedly temporary facility, but of course it lasted 70 years. It's now gone, but at the time it was there. And for lack of a better term, you know how a comb has, the main bar and then all the teeth hanging down?
Yes, like spokes.
Well, that's how this building was shaped. It was shaped with, kind of a back wall with 7, I guess, annexes or abutments sticking out of it. That's what the Navy Annex Building was. Now, at some point later, and I haven't discovered quite yet when they put this 8th part up. Now, it was attached, but it looked different from the other 7. It wasn't part of the original structure, in other words. Now, that building was torn down early. And while many of us talk about Building 7 in New York City, which is, of course, very relevant and should be talked about, no one's talking about Building 8 of the Navy Annex Building. Now, there's a documentary out there by Citizens for, 9/11 Truth. I don't recall precisely who did it, but again, folks can Google this and, look it up. But there's an interview with 2 Pentagon City police officers, or Pentagon police officers, pardon me. Pentagon City is a different part of town. There is a shopping mall there. But at the Pentagon, they have police officers, of course. And these were 2 stout, burly gentlemen who were interviewed at the gas station, which is now also gone. So again, this is south of the Pentagon. These police officers said that from their perspective, the plane that they saw go by was to their left. Now, left and right might not mean anything to the listeners, but to their opinion was that these planes, both of them, interviewed separately, so they didn't hear each other talk. They both said that the plane came from their left, which means it would never have crossed Columbia Pike and should have hit the Pentagon where it was believed it was hit. That's what they thought. It was pointed out in that documentary to them, yes, but way over there to the right from your perspective is where the downed light poles are. So what do you make of that, officers? And they both said, there's no way what I saw knocked those light poles down over there. I don't know what knocked those down. All I know is the plane I saw, and one of the officers even said that he saw the plane starting to lift up. Now, what many people believe, and it's hard to tell because there were people driving on these highways and roads around there. It's always tough to know who's legit and who isn't, because after all, this was a military installation. But there were people who said they did see planes. So I do want to be clear that, what I'm telling you is food for thought. I think, great food for thought. But I can't say that it's definitive. What I can say is the police officers who worked at the Pentagon being interviewed in uniform at the gas station that the police officers were at. And while these gentlemen are interviewing the police officer, he said, okay, officer, I want to tell you, that the tape from this gas station has now been released. And where you were parked at the gas pump, actually, officer, you were back to this pump. And the tape shows you backing up and peeling off. And he's like, yeah, oh yeah, I do remember that. So there's like there's certainly corroboration for the police officer's presence. And I don't think anyone doubts they were there. But they saw a trajectory that would have hit the Pentagon, which doesn't match the official version, which is more to their right, if you're looking north. That's where the downed light poles are. Now, you know, you and I may not be plane engineers, but it's also, you don't have to be a plane engineer to know that an aluminum plane, you know, we all see them get dented by geese at times, and, you know, you can get serious damage from just hitting a bird. So we're asked to believe that Hani Hanjour, who couldn't fly, who did crazy acrobatics over the mall and then again in Virginia, got this plane down to ground level, perhaps literally a handful of feet above the ground. Again, many pilots have said, I don't even know how they were able to do that. I couldn't do that at that speed because I think it was going about 500 miles an hour. So you've got this situation where a pilot who can fly in a jumbo jet who's doing acrobatics, and then he somehow gets the plane to ground level. And again, you simply can't fly a plane at 500 miles an hour a handful of feet off the ground. You just can't do it. And certainly if you have no skill, you can't do it. And many researchers out there can look for themselves and find out that, you know, most pilots will tell you, I'm an excellent pilot. I couldn't do it. I don't know how that guy did it. So at any rate, this Navy Annex building, in my view, is an extremely good candidate for firing a missile. We know that it's on Columbia, or was on Columbia Pike. It's now been torn down, that Building 8 part, and now the whole thing's been torn down. So this building, which according to this Washington Post article, and my friend confirmed this too because he lives there, it's on a hill overlooking the Pentagon. So you had a bird's eye view down from the Navy Annex building. And again, as I pointed out to you, what was in this building? Again, over the years, it was the Navy, it had Marines. It was always kind of a Navy building. But at the same time, the Missile Defense Agency was there. Now, I'm going to read to you, if I might, very briefly, just from the Missile Defense Agency, just from their website, MDA mission. The Missile Defense Agency's mission is to develop, test, and field an integrated, layered, ballistic missile defense system, BMDS, to defend the United States, its deployed forces, allies, and friends against all ranges of any enemy ballistic missiles in all phases of flight. All right, so you've got the Missile Defense Agency there. Now, let me give you the history, again, real brief. I'm going to read off their website, the Missile Defense Agency, which says, Missile Defense Agency traces its roots back to the origins of the Strategic Defense Initiative. Ronald Reagan launched his initiative in 1983 to develop non-nuclear missile defenses. So missile defenses is what the Missile Defense Agency does. They handle missiles. They deal with missiles, shooting down things. And they're on a hill overlooking the exact trajectory to the hole, which appears to have been caused by a missile. Because I don't think many people believe, other than those that buy the official story, I don't think many people believe that an aluminum plane could have penetrated into the C ring, which means 3 levels in of thick reinforced concrete and steel, without its wings breaking off. And we all know that there was no plane damage on the ground, unlike in the World Trade Center, where we're told jet fuel weakened steel and made the whole thing collapse. If you look at the initial holes in the Pentagon, the initial hole in the Pentagon, for example, you can see right, if you're looking at the hole, right to the lower left, there's a table with a book open. Can't read the book, but you can see that there's a book open. So we're told in New York City that the jet fuel was so hot and so catastrophic and the fires were so terrible that they weakened the steel and the plane and the buildings collapsed. Yet you've got the same amount of fuel because the plane that hit the Pentagon had only left, I believe, Dulles Airport, which is right here in Northern Virginia as well. And so it would have been full with gas or kerosene or airplane fuel, which is like kerosene. So the question is okay, you're telling us that the blazing inferno was so bad from the heat of this igniting of the airplane fuel, yet you look in the Pentagon, you don't see any burns. Again, there's a book wide open. There's not a page singed on that book. It's very difficult to believe. And again, I would reinforce the idea that this was the part of the Pentagon that itself had been reinforced. The only part, very curious indeed, that this man who allegedly picked this, he was going to hit the Pentagon, and he picked the only surface that had been reinforced. And so then he punches a hole deep into it with an aluminum plane. And again, many of us have a hard time believing, how did this plane not break apart? And anyone who looks at the evidence from the Pentagon will see that this thing penetrated deep into the Pentagon, like 3 layers, 3 rings, because the Pentagon is a series of rings. And, it's heavily reinforced even before they did the extra reinforcement. You're still not going to just break into that place. It's a military protected area, and the walls were already concrete and steel. So it's difficult to believe, if you look at the official trajectory and the official version, this plane, again, flying a few feet above the ground by an inexperienced pilot who had just done acrobatics that his flight instructor said he couldn't do, somehow gets this plane literally a handful of feet, 2, 3, 4, 5 feet, who knows, above the ground, and hits the ground floor of the Pentagon. And then he pushes that plane deep into, it's like a knife cutting into butter. I don't care that it's a big aluminum plane, and I don't care that it's going fast. Those wings would have broken off upon impact. And of course, we all know from looking at the pictures of the hole in the Pentagon that none of the windows were broken, which would have corresponded to where the wings should have hit. So either the wings didn't hit, or who knows, but where the wings would have necessarily hit. I mean, things like windows. You can say, maybe the wings just couldn't penetrate all that concrete, reinforced concrete. Yeah, except that there is no even broken window where the plane wings sticking out horizontally, or the tail, which sticks up vertically, north, going up. None of the windows were broken, so one would expect either these appendages to have broken off and be there on the ground outside, but instead there's no plane parts, and there's this deep hole through 3 rings of the Pentagon, and it's just difficult to believe. And again, what do we have that does correlate with the broken light poles? Again, there was an area, if you're looking north at the Pentagon, to the right, there's a bunch of downed poles, one of which hit a cab. And that trajectory seems to line up with the Navy Annex building, which just happened to house the Missile Defense Agency, which was, again, a building that was there since 1941, but was used for different programs from various elements of the military over the years. But we know that in Ronald Reagan's time, when he was doing the SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, if you recall, he was trying to get some way to shoot down missiles from the Russians, and many thought that was destabilizing at the time, but others said, hey, if you can do it, let's do it. But at any rate, around 1983, that's when the Strategic Defense Initiative Organization was created. That was later renamed the Ballistic Missile Defense Organization. And then the National Missile Defense Act of 1999 defined the mission, and in 2002, not long after 9/11, lessened the restrictions, develop and test certain techniques with respect to anti-ballistic missiles. And in 2002, again, right after 9/11, the Ballistic Missile Defense Organization, housed in the Navy Annex, was renamed to the Missile Defense Agency. And that building has now been taken down. So it is very difficult, in my view, in light of these things to really square the Pentagon hit. It's just too many implausibilities. So the last thing I would add to just the Pentagon hit itself was that I would have thought I would have heard a jumbo jet getting that low. But perhaps it was just maybe a mile and a half off, so that I heard nothing. I didn't hear the crash into the Pentagon, and I was standing on my balcony looking outside. I did see the smoke come up once it was hit by whatever. The Pentagon, I just find it very hard to believe it was hit by a jumbo jet. I can't remember if it was a 737. I think it might have been, but at any rate, it was a jumbo jet. And again, now those buildings are all gone. They're going to use that space for additional cemetery space for Arlington National Cemetery. Yeah, there's roads that go right by all of these things. And there are people who saw stuff, people who conflicted, because eyewitnesses can often see the same thing and report something slightly different or perhaps big time different. So I'm on 5th Street. That means I'm 5 blocks from the Capitol. 4th, 3rd, 2nd, and 1st Street. And then you've got the Capitol. Now, if you go the other direction, of course, you've got 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th. Again, the numbers run up and down, north and south. And 5th Street, if you look west, you get 6th Street, 7th Street, 8th Street, 9th Street, 10th Street. Well, when you get to 21st and 22nd Street in Washington, D.C., again, the southern part of the city, close to Virginia, you have the State Department. It's an area of town called Foggy Bottom. It's kind of close to Georgetown. But if you say Foggy Bottom, you're almost talking about the State Department or the Foreign Service. That's just simply where the State Department is. And the State Department is nothing. And at around 10:30 that morning, I personally, standing on my balcony, so I'm on 5th Street, around 21st, 22nd, you could clearly hear that this came from the western part of the city. The city's not that big, by the way. I heard a massive explosion, which, if you ask me, at that very moment, in fact, I did say at that very moment, that happened over in Foggy Bottom. That happened over by the State Department. Now, I heard that on the news. I don't remember if it was Dan Rather or Katie Couric. Whoever was, we were probably all flicking around channels watching the horror. But one of them mentioned that there was a truck bomb or a car bomb that exploded in front of the State Department. Now, I heard a massive explosion at 10:30 in the morning at that area of the city. The only confirmation I've ever got from that is from our friend, investigative journalist Wayne Madsen, who, again, he didn't hand me, photographs or some kind of smoking gun, and I'd have to ask him his sources, but he confirmed to me, I went to dinner with him once, and he confirmed to me that, yes, there was a car bomb that was detonated over by the State Department. So again, that too is not part of the official story. And I suppose the only other thing I would probably should add is that back again to this concept of if this plane was so low, how come people didn't hear it? A jumbo jet doesn't come 4 feet off the ground and you don't hear it. It's a loud affair. People should know that in Washington, D.C., we're blessed with tons of bike trails. Now, one of these bike trails, amongst many, 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 one goes down to Mount Vernon, which is where George Washington lived. And many people take their bikes. It's about a 20-mile ride down to Mount Vernon and back. But along that trail, many people, and it's just trendy to do, you might be riding bikes with your girlfriend that day, but the bottom line is a lot of people will come by and lay their bikes down and just literally lay on their back with their hands behind their head looking up and just watching the planes take off above them. And I can tell you, I've done it, and I'm sure everyone in D.C. has done it who's reasonably active. This is the cool thing to do. You go to National Airport, you lay your bicycle down, and you just lay down and watch these planes taking off over your head. Well, these planes are necessarily several hundred feet above us, and you can hear them very loud. So how is it that this plane came literally feet within the ground at 500 miles an hour? And why isn't there dozens of people coming forward saying, I heard this deafening noise? Some of the witnesses said they saw a plane, but it was quiet. The police officer described the plane that it was dipping up when he last saw it, which might lend credence to the idea that the actual plane that people saw flew over the Pentagon, and then the missile hit. And then the smoke of the Pentagon hit, the plane disappeared. Other people saw two planes. Again, there's another trajectory which does not match up with where the police officer said the plane was, and is coincidentally right in line with the Navy Annex building, which was housing the Missile Defense Agency. It seems to me that a very likely candidate for where that missile came from was the Navy Annex building, because I don't believe a plane hit the Pentagon. I believe a missile did. And again, Rumsfeld said a missile hit. The evidence suggests a missile hit, meaning no plane debris or wreckage. The fact that it penetrated so deep into heavily reinforced concrete, the only reinforced surface of the Pentagon, very convenient. It also housed some of the areas they were investigating, some of the wrongdoings of the Pentagon. Those were conveniently disappeared. So, like all of these 9/11 events, you really have crimes within crimes. Destroy evidence, silence certain people. Of course, you have Rumsfeld after the event, out on the lawn picking up tiny pieces of debris. One would have to think the Secretary of Defense would have a more solid role than being one of the guys who, he's in a suit. He's not in protective gear. He's not protecting himself against the fire foam. Suddenly he feels it's just important to walk around and pick up small pieces with 100 other people. Which, again, when you're under attack, I don't need my defense secretary, sweeping up things or doing menial tasks when, in fact, the truth is he had a bigger job to do. Those are my observations, and then I'll just add an anecdotal funny one, was, once I watched the two planes hit on TV, and the mayor came on and said, everybody stay home. If you don't have to go to work, don't. Stay off the streets, which I did. And I came out the next day and I had a street sweeping ticket on my car.
Oh, no.
To this day, I wish I framed it. Because I'm like, wait a minute, I just did what the mayor said. Don't go out. We're under attack. Yet DC did its parking enforcement.
Always on the job.
Who gave me a street sweeping ticket. I was like, you gotta be kidding me. In DC, you have to pay them in a month or they double. It's a complete racket in terms of parking. But there's, some degree of humor. It's also an absurdity. But I did get a ticket for not moving my car on the other side of the street in an environment where the United States was under attack that had never been witnessed before, and the mayor's on TV saying, don't take your car anywhere, stay out of downtown. And, I got a street sweeping ticket.
Well, after all, I guess it's pretty good that you're an attorney. I guess that helped a little bit afterwards. But hey, Brian, thanks for being on the show again, and thank you for sharing your experiences of 9/11.
No problem, ST. We'll talk to you soon, okay?
They are Richard Otto and Brian Lloyd. I'm ST Patrick on the Midnight Rider News Show, and we'll be back with James Corbett. Roswell, Area 51 and Bob Lazar, MJ-12, JFK, Art Bell, 9/11, Disclosure, and what's really happening on the moon. The great John Lear joined us to talk about all of this and more.
Hi, this is John Lear. If you want to know how my experiences took me to the alternative side of history and how they both landed me in the middle of the Bob Lazar story, download episode 11 of the Midnight Rider News Show.
James Corbett has been living and working in Japan since 2004. He started the Corbett Report website in 2007 as an outlet for independent critical analysis of politics, society, history, and economics. Since then, he has written, recorded, and edited thousands of hours of audio and video media for the website, including a podcast and several regular online video series. He produces video reports for GRTV, and he's the lead editorial writer for the International Forecaster, the weekly e-newsletter created by the late Bob Chapman. His work has been carried online by a wide variety of websites, and his videos have garnered over 40 million, that's million, views on YouTube alone. His satirical piece on the discrepancies in the official count of September 11th, which is called 911, A Conspiracy Theory, was posted to the web on September 11th, 2011. It has so far been viewed nearly 3 million times. The Corbett Report can be visited at corbettreport.com, and Corbett is spelled Corbett. James, how are you this evening?
I'm doing pretty well. Thank you for having me on.
James, I've told the story many times, but on September 11th, 2001, I was in a high school. I was teaching high school history, and the math teacher next door came in and said the towers have been hit. Now, I was about an hour and a half west of Chicago, and I thought that he meant the Sears Tower, but we learned quickly that it was the World Trade Center. And I want to ask you first, let's start here. Do you remember where you were and what your first initial thoughts and feelings were when you saw that the tower had been hit?
I certainly do remember. I was working my first real job after coming out of university. I was working as just a glorified office assistant, basically, at a commercial real estate office in downtown Calgary, Canada. And at that time, that day particularly, we had one of the owners of a couple of the properties that we were managing in town from Vancouver, so it was a big day, and he was being shown around and everything. So we were all busy with that, and then suddenly, of course, all of this started coming in over the, radio, actually. We had the radio on in the office. I remember that particularly. But I do recall arriving at work in the morning, and I was arriving at the same time as one of my coworkers who was a Filipino, who I sometimes had difficulties understanding what she was saying because in her broken English. And she said something about plane in the World Trade Center or something, and I didn't quite understand what she was saying, and I thought maybe there'd been some accident or something. But of course, it didn't quite turn out to be that. So that day was chaotic because I was dealing with it in the work environment and doing things like having to arrange some sort of alternative transport home for this building owner because he couldn't fly home that day and all of that kind of stuff. So I didn't really have time to process what was going on other than hearing these reports coming in over the radio. Now there's something happening at the Pentagon. And then there was reports of bombs at the Capitol and everything, which turned out again to not eventuate into part of the official story. So all of that was happening, and I was just sort of going through all the works-related stuff of that. For example, there was talk that we might be evacuating the buildings. I think one of the buildings in Calgary actually was evacuated because there were these planes that were being diverted from the U.S. and they didn't know if they were hijacked. So it was just a crazy day like that. And then I vividly remember coming home on the train from work, and it was... everyone was just in shock. There was someone listening to the radio on the train, and everyone was just listening to it. There was a special edition, evening edition of the local newspaper that had been printed for it with images of the World Trade Center smoking on it, and all of that. It was just craziness, and I didn't really have time to even begin processing it till that evening.
Wow, yeah, it's just amazing that everyone has such an individualized story that's so unique from that day. Now, do you remember the point where you started to think that the mainstream story that we were hearing may not be accurate?
I mean, certainly as I say, there were things that were being reported that day that ultimately didn't become part of the official story, like, bombs at the Capitol or sounds of bombs at the Capitol or that kind of thing. So clearly there was some confusion regarding the reporting, but for one, I didn't see the buildings collapse live on TV. I saw all of that later after the fact as, the edited down images of, and then it collapsed like this. And that was the way it was presented. And by that point, the story was already starting to form. So it was a kind of a fait accompli. And that's the way I was introduced to it. And hey, I was young, I was dumb, I didn't know much about anything. So I just thought, well, there you go. And I was, of course, concerned about the way that this was going to be used to... as a green light and a blank check for war, generally in the Middle East. But I was still probably under more of the blowback mindset at that time. Well, this is just blowback for... And I believe I read Noam Chomsky. They put out not a book, it was like a collection of interviews, basically transcripts of interviews he'd done along those lines, blowback for involvement in the Middle East. And that was really my line of thinking for years, and I wouldn't even countenance the idea that there was anything about a conspiracy around 9/11. That was just, that was not it wasn't an appropriate way to even think about this, and it was disrespectful to the dead and all of that. So it was 5 years, really, before I started questioning 9/11.
Now, I'm going to ask you what you believe happened that day. Now, yes, I know that's a big question with a big answer. What we really want to know is what you believe happened to those 4 planes. 2 in Manhattan, 1 outside of Washington, D.C., and 1 that supposedly crashed in a field in rural Pennsylvania.
Well, I don't care what I think happened, and I don't think anyone else should care what I think happened. I think we should only care about what we can actually say and what we can prove. And of course, there needs to be research into this. And of course, I have my theories and what have you, and it's based on this or that piece of information. But I would more frame it as, what can we say did not happen? And I can say with a great degree of confidence that certainly the official story, as propounded by the 9/11 Commission report and the NIST collapse reports, the ones on WTC 1 and 2, and then the separate one on WTC 7 that came out in 2008, are absolutely verifiably, provably untrue in a number of different respects. And I can say, if you want to break it down to brass tacks, the simplest way of putting it is, as it was stated by Bob Bowman, who was the former head of the Star Wars, defense program and all of that. He said, if the standard protocols and procedures had been followed on the morning of 9/11, if it had been just a regular day of regular response to hijackings and all of that, and everything was followed as by the book, 9/11 would not have happened the way it did. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. That's an extremely important thing to keep in mind. There was a stand down of air defenses that day, and it's undeniable, if for no other reason than the fact that the military itself offered not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 different versions of their timeline of what happened and what they were notified about and when and how. And that ranged from the very beginning, where the acting chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Richard Myers, told the early 9/11 investigation that we didn't have, there was no fighter jets scrambled at all at any point on 9/11. But he wasn't quite sure about that. That was 48 hours after 9/11 had occurred, and he still wasn't quite sure, but he thought that they hadn't scrambled anything. That was immediately revised. They offered a timeline of what they were notified about and when, and then they revised that timeline later on. And then the 9/11 Commission itself took it upon itself, once it released its report, to create that 4th different version of this story, basically saying that the military had been lying or mistaken for the entire proceedings of the 9/11 Commission, and that although they had said they had received advance notice of the various planes that had been hijacked, the official story then of the 9/11 Commission then became that they were only ever notified about the first plane, and they were given no warning whatsoever about any of the other planes. So they basically said that the military had been lying or mistaken to actually make the military seem more incompetent than it really was, which is an odd thing, unless you take it from the perspective that the 9/11 Commission was just covering up what NORAD was doing, or more accurately not doing, on that morning. And I think that's an exceptionally important part of this. Of course, everyone wants to talk about the way that the buildings collapsed and all of that, and I'm not a structural engineer. I don't get into the specifics of that. The best examination that I've seen of the official WTC 7 report from NIST and why it absolutely is wrong, identifiably, provably wrong, was a half-hour presentation by Kevin Ryan several years ago. It was on YouTube the last time I checked, but unfortunately I do not remember the name of the presentation on YouTube at this point. But if you can check for Kevin Ryan, WTC 7, it's an extremely thorough point-by-point examination of that I think gets to the point. And that, from my mind, is, in terms of the building collapses and all of that, it's good enough for me to know that it absolutely was not the way that the NIST official reports concluded. Beyond that, we get into, well, was it the energy weapons? Was it thermite? Was it this? Was it that? And ultimately that serves to, I don't want to say distract, but certainly to create division in the 9/11 truth movement that only has the effect of putting people at each other's throats and saying, if you don't believe what I believe, then you're not a 9/11 truther, and blah, blah, blah. And we see the way that ultimately 9/11 truth has completely devolved into a navel-gazing nothingness over the past several years, and part of that is precisely because people will only focus on their pet theories about what happened that day, rather than showing, which is the only thing that we in the public can do, and what we should be doing is showing that we have been lied to. And everything else that comes on top of that is, that's investigations and what have you, in a corrupt system that's never going to investigate itself. But if we can show 100% provably that the official story is false, then that is enough, or should be enough, to win the court of public opinion, which I think is what ultimately matters when it comes to 9/11. Obviously, we should continue to pursue justice for the events of that day, but I think the most pressing important part of this is to win over the hearts and minds of the public, to use that phrase, precisely because 9/11 was just one event in history of the type of event, false flag terrorism, that happens over and over and over and over and will continue to be used in the future unless we can educate the public that they have been lied to about events like this, specifically so that the powers that shouldn't be can enact their various war agendas and financial agendas. And without that understanding, without spreading that, then 9/11 truth is lost. And that's why I don't get into my theories about what happened at each part of the attacks.
I believe 9/11 is a more difficult story to cover than, say, the Kennedy assassination. Researching JFK can be done by talking to those in Dealey Plaza that day, talking to the employees of the Texas School Book Depository, talking to those who knew Jack Ruby personally. A researcher can get very close in proximity to the crime, even in 2017. September 11th, however, seems more difficult in a sense that there are 3 crime scenes, the death toll is in the thousands, and there are very few witnesses that close to the crimes or the alleged criminals who can be interviewed. So, is it a more difficult case to research because of the scope and spectrum of the crime?
To some extent, yes. To some extent, we do. I mean, one of the old canards that is often thrown around is that, well, someone would have talked. And because, there's no 9/11 whistleblowers, therefore 9/11 couldn't be a conspiracy of any sort, which of course is nonsense, because as we know, there have been many whistleblowers. There have been people in positions to know better that have talked in various capacities about what they know and how that contradicts what we've been told. For example, of course, Barry Jennings. He was the deputy director of emergency services for the New York City Housing Department, and on 9/11 he went to the Office of Emergency Management, which, of course, Rudy Giuliani had placed in World Trade Center Building 7, the very epicenter of any terror attack, which he was roundly criticized for after the events, but strangely not so criticized for before the events. He put the Office of Emergency Management in WTC 7, right there in this very spot where terrorists, quote unquote, had tried to attack less than a decade earlier. But that being what it is, Barry Jennings went to the Office of Emergency Management at WTC 7 with Corporation Counsel Michael Hess. They went up to the OEM, I believe it was on the 23rd floor of WTC 7, and there were steaming cups of coffee. People had just left. They had abandoned the building. As Giuliani later testified about, they had gone to the ready-made-up emergency coordination place that they had already designated for a FEMA drill that just happened to be taking place in 9/11. But they had already abandoned the building, so they decided to get out of the building. And as they're going down, they're going down the stairwell, and a bomb explodes. It blows him back up the stairwell. And Jennings was clear in the interview that he originally gave about his incident that this was not the collapse of the buildings. I believe at that point, the first building had already collapsed. The second building was not yet collapsed. And that was the point at which this explosion pushed them up the stairwell. Eventually they got out. They managed to break a window, and some firefighters heard them. They managed to get into the building and get Jennings and Hess out. But Jennings also claimed that they were stepping over dead bodies on their way out, which again contradicts the final report, which shows that there was no one killed in WTC-7. We have people like Michael Springman. He was the head of, the head of the visa section at the U.S. consulate in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, back in the 1980s, when, as he put it, they were funneling terrorists or what have you, Al-Qaeda personnel, for their golden boy in Afghanistan at that time, Osama bin Laden. The CIA was basically overriding all of his refusals to give visas to these very suspect people, and he had no idea what was going on. He went back to the United States and discovered through his contact in Joseph Trento, they were this was the CIA funneling fighters for Osama bin Laden back to the United States for training, and then they would be funneled back to Afghanistan. So this Jeddah office was known for that, and was the exact office where 15 of the alleged 9/11 hijackers, the total of 19 alleged hijackers, 15 of them received their visas to enter the United States at that very Jeddah consulate, many of them through a Visa Express program that had just been put in earlier that year specifically to handle that. We have the 9/11 commissioners themselves. 6 of the 10 commissioners have personally raised questions about the 9/11 commission, including Kane Hamilton, who said they were set up to fail, Kerry, Romer, Lehman, Cleland. Max Cleland said that the commission had been deliberately compromised by the President of the United States. Bob Kerry said that 9/11 was a 30-year conspiracy, but no media channel followed up with him on that. Just craziness like that. So there have been many, many people, Sibel Edmonds, Bill Bergman, Richard Grove, others who have personal access to this story that we could look at. Of course, we don't have the whistleblower, so to speak, the person who said this is the man who ordered this and this is how it went down. But we do have so many different ways in that are completely, of course, neglected in anything approaching mainstream media.
Judging from the email I received, it appears that many would like to ask you how high the chain of responsibility takes us. So who in government is ultimately responsible, and how high does this go?
There is no way that this could have taken place without high-level government help, high-level military help, and high-level intelligence help. And that doesn't necessarily limit it down to who will be the person at the top. But I would say it would be almost inconceivable for 9/11 as some sort of inside job operation to be the truth without, say, Dick Cheney being heavily involved in that. Now, to say that that means that Cheney is at the top of that pyramid, I, of course, couldn't say. But I do believe that someone like Cheney would have to be involved in it, as well as certain military personnel and certain intelligence personnel, which goes to the question of how many people would have to be involved in the first place. And I really don't think it would have to be in the thousands, as some would posit, precisely because of the nature of these types of intelligence operations. They can be masked and concealed in various ways so that people who are even participating in the plot do not necessarily know they are participating in the plot, or perhaps after the fact might see a little piece of the puzzle that they had without knowing the full extent of the plot. Now, an example of how that can happen is the various types of tests and drills and simulations that were going on, even on the very morning of 9/11. We cannot see 9/11 as a day of typical aviation over the skies of the United States. It was a forest of drills and hijacking drills and all sorts of things that were taking place on and around 9/11 that obviously affected the response that day. In those types of things, you have, for example, red team, blue team scenarios where a red team tries to challenge the security of a system or of a military or what have you, and the blue team tries to defend against it. Now, of course, this is all supposed to be simulated, and this isn't really taking place unless it is, and that can be brought into these types of scenarios so that you have for example, a Phantom Flight 11 that NORAD claims they were tracking after Flight 11 had actually crashed, well, they're tracking this phantom blip on their radar screens that they can't explain. Well, was this part of a simulated inject in one of the simulations that was going on the morning of 9/11? There remains, to this day, there has not been a thorough explanation of the various things like that were going on, let alone a full itemization or a full categorization of the drills that were actually taking place. Researchers have discovered literally dozens of drills and simulations that at least impinge on 9/11, several of which were taking place, confirmed on the morning of 9/11, several of which were speculated to be taking place on 9/11, but FOIA requests and such can only get so far. So it really is difficult to see the operation, even when you're within the operation, and that's because it can be masked in various ways. So I think there does have to be certain personnel, obviously, in very strategic positions who can coordinate this, but it doesn't necessarily mean that all the people under them are taking part in it. Now, again, I think there is almost certainly involvement of outside intelligence agencies as well. This is not simply an inside job within the United States. Clearly, Mossad was involved in some manner, and we're clearly tracking, at any rate, the alleged hijackers, or what became the hijackers. And there are all sorts of things regarding the urban moving systems and the various people in place in New York, for example, and all of those shenanigans that were going on around WTC and these alleged hijackers that clearly point to involvement of Mossad at the very least, and likely other intelligence agencies as well. Again, who is pulling the strings? Difficult to say, and I'm not sure that would necessarily... I think, again, there would have to be different people taking place in this for different objectives and agendas. I don't think an event like 9/11 takes place for one single reason. It takes place because of a multitude of reasons. So everyone who would be participating in that plot would have some reason for participating in the plot. It is even conceivable in such a situation that there is no single mastermind per se who is giving the order, so much as there are various people who can bring that about. I will do this, you will do that, with a tacit agreement for their own purposes. So again, it goes back to speculation, and as I say, I don't think that speculation is necessarily helpful with this.
We have 2 emails to ask you about, one from Mike in Arkansas who asks, James, I've always been very interested in the fate of United 93. Do you believe that 93 actually crashed outside of Shanksville, was shot down over Pennsylvania, or was it never over Pennsylvania at all?
Well, I would say, based on my own research, again, this is speculation, but I would say that it was most likely shot down. And we have that from several different sources, including Indira Singh, who people might better know as the whistleblower who blew the whistle on P-TECH and that whole story, which is an entire other part of 9/11. But she was also working as an emergency responder that day and claimed to have heard over the emergency response airwaves basically the fact that they had confirmed they had shot down 93. And then, of course, they gave the whole story about Let's Roll and all of that, which, of course, was literally turned into the Hollywood version of 9/11. So it was a convenient narrative placed on the fact that the plane was shot down. If that is the case, and I think it certainly matches up with, it at least corresponds with what we know about the physical scene itself, where parts were strewn over several miles, which, of course, is physically impossible if it just bore straight down into the ground. So it exploded in midair, destroyed by a missile, and that makes sense with the physical side of it. It also makes sense from the perspective of the narrative, as I say, because they were able to construct the narrative, the Valiant narrative about the passengers overtaking it and all of that. And I think there was a third point I was about to mention, but I've just lost my train of thought, so I don't remember.
Okay, let's go to the question from Steve in Las Vegas. He wants to know if you believe that Osama bin Laden was actually dropped into the ocean on the day reported by the Obama administration and by the mainstream media.
Yes, the bin Laden element of all of this is, again, worthy of 1,000 hours rather than a few minutes. But the reason that we put the blame on bin Laden in the official story is because he confessed. We all saw it, or if we didn't, we at least know that there is a confession tape that was magically discovered in, I believe, in Kabul, shortly after the invasion of Afghanistan began. The troops were out on their door to door, knocking down random doors in Kabul, and magically found this videotape that they played it. Hey, what's this? And hey, it's Osama bin Laden confessing to 9/11. If you believe that, I have a bridge in Timbuktu to sell you. But that was the official story of that. I did an interview about this bin Laden confession tape several years ago that I think is worth re-listening to. It's in my archives that I hope people would give a listen, because the standard response from 9/11 Truth for many years was that, this was fat bin Laden. If you look at the tape, or if you look at a certain still image from the tape, it looks like a very fat man that doesn't bear a lot of striking resemblance to Osama bin Laden. So it was just an actor, basically. There are numerous reasons why I don't side with that interpretation. One of which is that clearly some of the other members in the room, if you actually go and watch the tape, clearly some of them absolutely can be identified, including, I want to say, Zawahiri. I believe he was in the room. At any rate, it was a high-ranking al-Qaeda operative who was in the room that is clearly identifiable. And so again, then the question is, why would they use an actor for bin Laden if they are using real al-Qaeda players in this tape? It doesn't make any sense. And secondly, if you watch the actual tape, from the whole tape, from the beginning of the tape where he walks into the room, there is no doubt this is a 6'5" or whatever, very large, very gaunt, it was Osama bin Laden, or the man formerly known as Osama bin Laden. There's no doubt about that. So what is this tape about? Well, I think it's perhaps more interesting to look at the fact that a German television news magazine, kind of like 60 Minutes, did a report shortly, I believe in 2002 or 2003, where they got their own translator to translate that tape, rather than relying on the Pentagon's translation. And their translator found that at every point at which it seemed that bin Laden was making some sort of claim, we calculated that it would do this and blah, 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 which is taken as proof. He was involved in the plot. He was doing it. At every single point in that transcript where such a claim was made, it was basically a mistranslation, or the Pentagon was translating it in a way that put the emphasis on, he was involved in this plot. Whereas when they translated it, it really wasn't. It was just, we saw what happened that day and we were happy, kind of thing. So I think that's more interesting. And then, of course, when you look more broadly into the story of Osama bin Laden and who he was and where he came from and his role in Afghanistan in the 1980s, working with the CIA, and all of that history, I think it puts that story into more perspective. And then, when you add it to the fact that he was on dialysis, did require treatment, was, according to CBS News, as introduced in a story introduced by Dan Rather and reported on by the CBS News evening news team back in, I believe, 2003, so not exactly conspiracy theory land here, he was in Rawalpindi on the evening of September 10th. In a military hospital, under guard of the Pakistani ISI, i.e. the CIA, because the ISI and the CIA are joined at the hip. They're co-constructs. The U.S. intelligence absolutely 100% would have known that Osama bin Laden was in Rawalpindi at that military hospital that evening. So they would have known exactly where he was at that time. But then, somehow or other, he gets back into Afghanistan and is suddenly being targeted, quote unquote, by the ISI, by the NATO forces, and gets cornered in Tora Bora, but somehow or other slips across the border and gets away. Who would have known? And then years later is discovered in Abbottabad, at the heart of the Pakistani military complex, basically. The story is ridiculous on its face, on every level. The botched raid, all of it, and then dumping him in the ocean before anyone had a chance to do anything. They took some pictures but won't release them, and they took some DNA, which they had gotten through some crazy campaign about some vaccination thing that they used as a cover to get DNA from what they thought was bin Laden's family. It was just an insane story on every level with no confirmation of any sort, and yet we're expected to swallow it hook, line, and sinker. Again, I think anyone who looks at this critically will know that at the very least, absolutely none of that story about bin Laden and his involvement in 9/11 has been proven. beyond a shadow of a doubt, or even beyond, the whisper of a doubt.
Oh, I absolutely agree. I think what Steve is asking, though, is how do you think Osama bin Laden died, and at what point in the narrative do you think he died?
Again, speculation, so I truly couldn't say. I would say it was sometime between 2001 and 2011, and I really don't know, because he had been either pronounced dead or speculated to be dead by numerous people, including high-ranking American officials, in that time window. Well, by 2006, even high-ranking officials of the FBI were saying, "Oh, he's probably dead by now," and things like this. I think that's probably right for a man who was on dialysis, who clearly could not have survived in the conditions that they were telling us he survived in. It seems most likely to me that he did die at some point in that period, but I don't know. There was even reports, even carried by Fox News, that that he had died in Afghanistan in the passover to Pakistan in late 2001, and there had been a burial for him. That was reported, but it was a secondhand story. So take it for what it's worth. There were numerous other reports of his death between that time. So, again, I don't know for sure, but I imagine that he died at some point. And when you do the video analysis of the videos that, of course, were being released during that period between 2001 and 2011, you find especially the 2007 release and some of those that took place around that time, not only clear digital manipulation in terms of basically CGI, but also the actual technical analysis of the video was done by a researcher whose name is going to escape me off the top of my head, but it was reported on by Wired and other publications, who did some examination of the layers in the video file itself, and was able to find that the Al-Qaeda watermark on the screen was inserted into the video at the same time as the watermark for the entity that was releasing the video, again, I'm not going to remember the name, but there is this counter-terror organization, this intelligence, I believe Site Intelligence, but it might have been a different group, that at any rate is supposedly discovering these Al-Qaeda videos and then releasing them to the public, or releasing them to government and media, and then they're released to the public from there. And the technical analysis of the video showed that the Al-Qaeda watermark was added at the same time as the watermark for this agency that was supposedly finding and releasing these videos. So, again, and in fact, they had released an earlier release of one of the Al-Qaeda videos that showed bin Laden in Afghanistan pre-9/11, had actually been shown on a I want to say BBC, at any rate, it was a British television mockumentary before the release of the actual Al-Qaeda video. It was shown in this construction that had been made for this kind of TV semi-documentary that used some real-life footage and what have you. But at any rate, somehow or other, they got an official Al-Qaeda release before it was released. There are things like this within the story of that show that there was obviously, we cannot take at face value any of the communications that were said to be coming from quote-unquote Osama bin Laden during that period from 2001 to 2011.
I always like to ask experts in a field this question. Other than your own outstanding work, if someone wants to know more about 9/11, who do they read, who do they watch? I am a very big fan of Kevin Ryan. He does a lot of hard work of real research and doesn't I think get into the speculation trap. And he does a lot of great work, including Another 19, which was a book that he wrote a couple of years ago talking about another 19 suspects for 9/11 rather than the 19 hijackers that we've heard so much about. And he identified people like Cheney and Myers and others in positions that would have been able to affect that. And I think that's an important work to keep in mind. And I did do some homage to that in some of my work in the past. Other than that, individual stories of various people that are spread out in various locations are important. I think the story of Sibel Edmonds and what she brings to bear on 9/11 is important. The story of Indira Singh and P-Tech, for me, is an extremely important and underexplored part of 9/11. The story of people like Bill Bergman working at the Federal Reserve, talking about the financial aspects of that. Michael Rupert did groundbreaking work on the financial aspects of 9/11 early on.
including talking about the money that was being taken out of the WTC systems as the attacks were happening. Things like that I think are important to understand. And there have been numerous documentaries over the years, but I'm not going to be able to think of them all off the top of my head.
If anyone out there would like to read, watch, or contact you, how would they go about doing so?
Go to CorbettReport.com, CORBETT report.com. If you're interested in 9/11 specifically, you can just type 9/11 into the search bar on the site, and you'll see some of my work. I've done 9/11 trillions, talking about the financial aspects of it. I've done 9/11 suspects, talking about, as I say, some of the other suspects that we should be looking at with the story. I've done 9/11 a conspiracy theory is probably my best known video. It's a 5-minute short parody version of the official story, showing that that's the most ridiculous of all the conspiracy theories about what happened on 9/11. So I've done a lot of work over the years that people could check into that way, and there's a contact form there on CorbettReport.com that people can reach me at directly.
James, you do a fantastic job at CorbettReport.com. Thank you for being on our show tonight.
Well, thank you for that, and thank you for having me on.
I'm ST Patrick. This is the Midnight Rider News Show, and we'll be right back. I want to thank Richard Otto, Brian Lloyd, and James Corbett for being on tonight. As we were scheduling James, he told us that he only had 30 minutes, so we took it. It was an honor to have him on, and we decided that 30 was better than 0. He's working on a pretty big project right now, so his time is scarce. However, when that project is out, we know you're going to like it. Trust us. Tonight, there was much discussion of the word speculation. James is not a fan of it, and I understand that. Brian and Richard, as attorneys, aren't fans of it either, and I understand that. I would like to say, though, that I think speculation has value. I think it's fine as a starting point, and even as an end where true history remains muddied by secrecy. I'm not a fan of an egotistical, contrarian guessing game when certain facts are available, but I'm not opposed to looking at what we have and trying to piece a puzzle together. When discussing in a pair or in a group, it can be incredibly valuable to share facts and then discuss what they might mean in the absence of detailed smoking gun evidence, and that is speculation. 9/11 is still a dense forest of murky greenery. I contend that it's a harder case than most. There are very few confirmed facts, and as time goes by, more and more experts with doctorates emerge with competing theories that grow larger by the year. Maybe I'm just old-fashioned, which is very possible, but I'm leery of putting our eggs into one technological basket. When everything is on YouTube or Twitter, or God forbid, Facebook, what happens when that technology dies or suffers a major case of censorship? 9/11 has produced some great books. Yes, it absolutely has. But nothing like many of the other late 20th century events. I'm still hopeful that 9/11 researchers will find it important to write and get published on paper. I'm still hoping that for the great return of newsletters on paper. Now, I know there will never be another Mae Brussel copying, packaging, and sending cassette tapes to mailing list subscribers. But there was something so concrete about that, to have something in your home, in your possession. This is a generation that rejects ownership. More and more, they rent their homes, they rent their movies, they stream their music, they stream their television, and they carry their digitized books on a tablet. This frightens me. We have yet to see a monumental crash of the internet or of a major storage entity. But what happens when we do? Do you really believe we never will? What happens when the great burning of the library at Alexandria occurs on the terms of 2018, 2021, or even 2045? Where will we be? I just received my hard copy of Jim Marr's last book, The Illuminati, and off to read it is where I'll go now. From the other side of the mountain, on the best side of midnight, I wish you peace.
The Midnight Rider News Show with ST Patrick is a production of MidnightRiderNews.com. Copyright belongs to ST Patrick and all rights reserved. You can email us at MidnightRiderNews@gmail.com and be sure to visit MidnightRiderNews.com for the best in alternative historical analysis. This is Leanne saying thank you for listening, have a great night, and always remember, when life throws you lemons, throw them back and demand chocolate.